Yeah, thank you so much, Julia. Thank you so much, Zrinka. Thank you, everybody, for being here. I am going to share my screen. I have a PowerPoint, and I promise to be on time. Yeah, within the current debate around the role of classics and its inherent ideologies, decolonizing, etc., I have noticed a particular tendency to historicize and personalize both the ancient evidence, the author, the text, the source, the object, the event, and the role of scholars. More generally, there is a strong need to identify, to historically situate, and to find a strong connection with our own concerns. This is not to say that in the history of the discipline, this wasn't happening. But now it seems to be happening overtly and systematically. Indeed, there is a relationship between the classical past and our time, which can be well described as allelo-poetical. Allelopoiesis is a term coined by the cultural theorist Hartmut Böhme, who between 2005 and 2016 created the research group Transformations of Antiquity. Allelopoiesis means it is not only the ancient product that influences what comes afterwards in terms of reception, but it is also our time that influences and shapes the classical text, artifact, event, etc. Nowadays, any classicist, even those most naively attached to a simple ideal of historical truth, would certainly not deny that our own view and perception as modern scholars shape the classical world. Accordingly, in the last decades, we have been experiencing what in fact is a major paradigm shift, from the illusion of classics as an essentially reconstructive discipline to a fundamental disenchantment. We are the ones who shape our antiquity, and so we actively, explicitly, and no longer implicitly seek there what we find interesting for us. It is as if we lost our pudor. We are disinhibited scholars who know what we want. The discussion raised around, but by any means reducible to, what has been named decolonizing classics is a consequence of this loss of shame, as I call it. For reasons of time, I can only refer here to two particularly problematic examples that I believe well represent the current situation. Denise Eileen McCoskey, in her book Race, starts her inquiry by remarking that few other features of modern life are essential to our experience as race. The scope of her book is to unveil modern projections onto antiquity. And this is a description of the volume. The second example is represented by the arguments produced by ancient political philosopher Danielle Allen in an article of 2020 in AJP, American Journal of Philology. The conclusion can be epitomized in a single sentence. A connected classics profession would be only actively seeking to diversify cohorts of students, staff, and academic personnel in order to contribute to a general reworking of the social fabric of democracy in the direction of bridging relationships in which people share knowledge, acquired from different contexts, and also share power. Achieving such a connected classics profession requires openness to change in the nature of the discipline's research agenda. From this final coda, it results that Allen considers the biography and provenance of scholars essential for changing the profession in the field and its research agendas. By the way, I don't see why this kind of connected profession should be limited to classics departments. Moreover, Allen implicitly takes for granted the specifically North American academic system as a universal model valid always and everywhere. In both cases, which I cannot discuss at length today, crucial to researching classics is the scholar herself, with her visions, intentions, and biases. Central to both projects, as to the vast majority of discussions, is our contemporary context that now openly directs the identification of topics that are considered relevant to us. In both examples I've cited, race and diversity are the particular concerns. Several years ago, I co-edited with Chris Kraus a book with the title Marginality, Canonicity, Passion. I emphasized the difference between two concepts, relevant and important. I'm happy to say that this is the least read and the least quoted book I have ever contributed to. It should be classified under the heading useless, and rightly so, for who would care about something which is marginal and not relevant? In the introduction to that volume, I was arguing that what is important might not be always relevant to us. And this book is not alone in its uselessness. In fact, it is even in good company. The volume Post-Classicisms continues and develops in a more sustained way some of the conceptual threads contained in the Marginality book. In particular, I'd like to refer to the chapter devoted to value, which is mostly connected with my topic. The authors who present themselves as a collective complain about the fact that both in teaching and in standard studies, such as commentaries on texts, value is neither mentioned nor interrogated, but is rather presumed. And this reticence, they continue, is odd, since there is no shame in acts of evaluation. Assigning value is something we do all the time, whether consciously or not. Of course, the collective fully recognizes the historicity and limitedness of such evaluations, which are subject to an incremental correction and supplementation of error. But still, they insist value is necessary, since to claim to value equally of all of antiquity would be absurd. It would be a perverse set of values that could not distinguish between the worth of Homer and that of a stray pottery scatter in archaeological survey. And this is something maybe Ute would like to point to. Instead, they conclude to value antiquity is to make choices about what to privilege. Above all, we cannot live without ascribing value, ranking things, making choices. For values are the inevitable byproduct of any act of attention. The death of value is not depreciation, but inattention and boredom. Today, I would like, instead of value, I would like to introduce vertigo as perhaps the most relevant, useful, important factor at the same time within and outside of classics. The vertigo I'm referring to is provided by a macroscopic urgency, so macroscopic that we in fact keep forgetting it, the urgency of the environment and its ubiquitous more than human presence. Diverting our attention as readers of ancient texts or observers of ancient artifacts from what we usually believe to be relevant for us to the continuous, unavoidable, and besetting presence of the environment radically changes everything. It makes us aware of the incommensurability between the needs of humans and their environment. Timothy Morton famously coined the term hyperobject in order to name phenomena which go well beyond human perception and which influence human perception without being located and fully perceived. The typical example is, of course, climate warming, an entity so massively distributed both in time and space that it cannot be locally perceived. Another Timothy Clark, in his book, The Value of Ecocriticism, focuses on scalar literacy as a hermeneutic tool. The focus on scale is relevant because it teaches us how to discuss and make sense of entities such as environmental issues that are outside of the local embodied perception. As Clark notices, attention to scale has the effect of enmeshing environmental questions more deeply and perplexingly into the nature of politics and social debate. Considering scale ultimately leads us to grasp the paradox that one cannot act locally only, and that any action here and now affects the whole world now or later. Scale critique represents a fundamental intellectual posture that considers how a certain phenomenon or situation is radically altered according to the scale at which it is considered. Now, there is another fundamental question to ask, more relevant to classicists, perhaps. How relevant is this question to classicists? How can current environmental preoccupations influence the study of the distant past, a past so remote from our highly industrialized societies and our concerns with climate warming and consequent endangerment of humanity itself? It is at this point that Vertigo as a hermeneutic practice intrudes on the scene in several intertwined ways. The vertigo established by the perception of different scales, which make the classical as limited part of much more extended phenomena. The vertigo introduces by the consideration of the Anthropocene, a geological era that minimizes and at the same time interjects history as a purely human thing lost in the deep time of the universe. The vertigo caused by the profound discontinuity of the perception of reality opposed to the interconnectedness of the whole, amply demonstrated by environmental criticism. Finally, the vertigo that is imposed to us by biopolitics, as for instance described by philosopher Roberto Esposito, who describes its role in these terms. If we take up any perspective, we see that something that goes beyond the customary language appears to involve directly law and politics, dragging them into a dimension that is outside their conceptual apparatuses. This something, this element, this substance, this substrate, this upheaval is precisely the subject of biopolitics. Esposito's inquiry is based on ancient philosophical and scientific nomenclature. Bios is the title of his book, and terms such as zoe and techne are constantly evoked and discussed. Already this detail should make us classicists aware of the contribution which our discipline is called to make to this potentially limitless debate. An incredible research possibility is now open. Can we, as modern readers preoccupied with the current environmental crisis, identify a prefiguration of our situation in ancient and pre-modern texts? Timothy Morton again suggests that, and I'm quoting, we are only just beginning to think the ecological thought. Whatever exactly we call it, this thought can become a constant companion with which to approach our world and our texts. It is a totalizing but also liberating mode. And I'm quoting again, the more you consider it, the more our world opens up. Its power is ubiquitous since it affects all areas of thinking. Following Morton's path, Virginia Burroughs points out that ecological thought, while propelling us forward toward a future as yet barely imaginable, also draws us back to the past only dimly recalled. But this past is by no means a purer time and place, which would not help us in any case. Rather, the pursuit of a usable past evokes a context as complex and in its own way as compromised as our own. Burrus devotes her attention to early Christian texts and culture, but the question urges itself on us for every pre-industrial past. One of the tasks Giulia, SISSA, and I would like to take up in our book project is to consider the effects of these broader methodological and theoretical discussions in hermeneutic practices as we interpret the past. Following this idea, I would like briefly to refer to a text on which I've been working for a while, and which is at the center of my current project, the preface to the late Latin poem, The Rape of Proserpina, The Rapto Proserpine, wrote by Claudius Claudianus in the late 4th century. I won't read the text because you have the text in the slide. This beautifully crafted poem of 12 lines tells a simple story. There is a man, the first who decides to cross the sea on a boat. Gradually, after having trained himself in the controlling of nature through his technique and having overcome his fear, this man leaves the coast and with his boat finally reaches the open sea. This text is a specific manifestation of the vertigo I'm arguing for. The action is located outside of time in a prehistoric past. It can be read as the foundational act of the Anthropocene, a man who, for the first time, takes control of his environment by building a boat with the wood of an alder tree, Alnus, in order to cross the sea and so to take control over the force of nature. While crossing the ocean, he projects on to the water his earthly knowledge. The vocabulary used is that of ploughing, sollicitare, which he is then able to master. In the Lesian terms, he applies the category of the striated space, typical of his original environment, the land, on the smooth space of the sea. While the former is the hierarchically structured space of the sedentary, the latter is the space of the not yet coded and controlled space of the nomad. In Esposito's terms, the passage from one dimension to another is marked by techne, the third element which completes the duet of bios, by which he means a qualified life, and zoe, the biological capacity of life, la tenuta biologica in the original text. This sense of techne is represented both by the boat made of an earthly element, the wood of the alder, and the art of navigation. Techne appears here as the necessary trait d'union between land and sea, defined by Carl Schmitt as the fundamental human dimensions in a famous book bearing precisely this title, Land und Meer. In the final scene, the sailing man wholly masters the tempests, the only elements that receive a proper name, Aegeas Iemes et Ionium Domat. In this short poem, which I have only briefly introduced to you, a primordial situation is presented. As a reader, I perceive a vertigo that makes time and space collapse into another. I observe a tale of the origins of human control over the environment, the passage from land to sea, from sedentary to nomadic, from non-signifying to signification, from a striated to a smooth space, from zoe to bios. I see a single human in a landscape that represents the entire universe in its three components, terra, mare, and caelum, land, sea, and sky. Above all, through vertigo, I see a text that materializes itself by becoming a boundary itself. Right in the middle of the poem is located the syllexis legens. To me, this syllexis, i.e. a term which collapses together different meanings, demonstrates that language constantly fluctuates between signification and absence of meaning. And in this apparent absence of meaning, there emerges the infinite possibility of thinking the ecological thought, as Morton says, and of discovering infinite worlds opening up. Thank you.